I want the Omega they call useless.
The iron chandeliers of the great hall burned low that night, their amber light pressing down over stone floors, silk gowns, and the rigid silence of a room holding its breath. 10 she-wolves stood in a ceremonial line, 10 bloodlines, 10 families, 10 mothers who had spent the past 3 weeks arranging their daughters like weapons aimed at a throne. They wore deep jewel tones, each gown selected for what it communicated, rather than what it felt like to wear. Rubies to signal old blood, emerald to announce land holdings, onyx to whisper of power that did not need to announce itself. The women themselves were polished to the edge of perfection, back straight, expressions designed to say, "I was made for this. I deserve to be here." None of them were wrong, exactly. That was the cruelest part of what was about to happen. And Alpha King Hubert Carter descended the stone steps from his throne with the kind of stillness that tends to arrive in a room before thunder does. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, dressed in the black ceremonial coat of the Alpha King, its structure severe at the shoulders, wolf insignia pressed into the leather at the cuffs and chest fastening. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He wore no unnecessary expression. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent a decade learning how to govern a room without raising his voice. The council elders sat along the left wall, stiff with expectation. Noble families had packed the upper galleries. Servants had pressed themselves to the far edges of the hall, careful not to breathe louder than necessary. This was the formal lunar selection before the winter summit. If this was the night the Alpha King was supposed to secure his future and the pack's political stability in a single, dignified choice. Everyone in the hall believed they already knew what that choice would look like. Marilyn Wortman stood at the far edge of the hall, near the passage that connected to the scullery corridor. She held a silver tray with 6 untouched goblets of spiced wine, her sleeves rolled to the elbow from a morning that had started before sunrise. Her dress was a faded ash brown, worn soft at the seams, practical in the way that only poverty makes practical. Her hair was loosely pinned, a few dark strands falling where they wanted to, because she had not had a spare moment to do anything about them. What a bruise had darkened one wrist, where a supply crate had slipped that morning, and caught her before she could pull back in time. She had not been invited to this ceremony. She was there because someone had to carry the goblets, and she was the person who always did the things that needed doing.
Keep
your eyes down, she told herself. Do not shift your weight. Do not make noise. Become part of the wall. She had been practicing that particular skill for most of her life. Hubert reached the bottom of the steps. He did not pause before the first she-wolf. He did not smile at the second, or slow his pace at the third, even when she gave a perfectly rehearsed curtsy that made her gown sweep the floor like water. He walked past the 4th, the 5th, the 6th. The 7th woman's mother, seated in the gallery, gripped the arm of her chair. And the 8th, the 9th, the 10th. He had not stopped. The room did not understand what it was watching yet. Hubert kept moving. He walked past the end of the ceremonial line, past the council table, past the first row of attendants. He walked the length of the hall, his boots quiet on the stone, until he reached the far edge of the light, where the scullery passage met the shadows, where Marilyn Wortman stood with her tray and her bitten-back breath.
I want the
He
Omega
stopped.
they call
He raised one hand and pointed, straight at her. I want the Omega they call useless. The tray left her fingers before she could stop it. 6 goblets struck stone. The sound cracked through the silence, like a branch breaking in deep winter, and every head in the great hall of Ashmore Crown turned toward the edge of the room, toward the girl in the ash-brown dress, toward the spilled wine spreading slowly across cold grey stone. Marilyn stood with empty hands and a face that had forgotten what expression to wear. He is pointing at me. He is pointing at me. That cannot be right. But Hubert Carter did not lower his hand. He did not glance back at the 10 women in silken jewels. He did not correct himself or reach for a diplomatic retreat. He waited, with the patience of a man who had already decided. In the galleries, someone made a sound that was not quite a gasp, and not quite a word. Council Elder Damien Marsh rose half out of his seat. Kathy Bales, standing first in the ceremonial line, went very, very still. And in the far corner of the upper gallery, Tricia Drain, Queen Mother of Ashmore Crown, folded her hands in her lap, said nothing at all, and watched with the eyes of someone who had been waiting a long time for something she could not yet name. The fate of the throne, the pack, and one forgotten girl cracked wide open in that moment, and nothing in the great hall would ever be the same again. Before we go any further, take a moment. How are you feeling right now? Because I need to check in with you before this story pulls you somewhere you cannot easily leave. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It genuinely means everything. If this story is already moving something in you, and I believe it is, please subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Smash that like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Those small actions carry this story further than you know. Thank you. Now let us go back to Ashmore Crown, where Marilyn Wortman is standing in a puddle of spilled wine, convinced she is dreaming. Ashmore Crown was the oldest pack settlement in the Northern Territories, built into the face of a granite ridge so ancient that the stone had turned the colour of old bone. Its great hall had hosted 300 years of ceremonies, treaties, feuds, and quiet cruelties dressed up as tradition. The ranking system that governed its wolves was older than the hall itself, and far harder to tear down than stone. At the top sat the Alpha bloodlines, whose names were carved into the council seats. Below them, the high-born houses, who furnished those councils with daughters and sons, money and influence, and the occasional convenient marriage. Below them, the mid-ranked wolves, who did skilled work and kept a respectful distance from both ends. And at the bottom, barely spoken of in formal gatherings, were the Omegas. Omegas were not weak. Or that was the lie the rest of the pack told itself to feel comfortable about the way it treated them. Omegas were the ones with the deepest emotional resonance, the strongest pack-steadying instincts, the capacity to calm aggression in moments that might otherwise end in blood. They were the kind of wolves who made communities function without anyone thanking them for it. They were essential and overlooked in equal measure. Marilyn Wortman had lived that particular contradiction for 23 years. She had grown up in the outer household of the palace, the daughter of a man she barely remembered, and a mother who had died when Marilyn was 7. No family with standing had claimed her. No council had registered any concern for how she was managed. She had simply been absorbed into the lower household work by the time she was old enough to carry things without dropping them, and she had been there ever since. She was not bitter about it. Not exactly. She was simply honest with herself in the way that people who cannot afford illusions tend to be. She knew what she was in Ashmore Crown. She also knew what she was worth. The two things had never matched, and she had learned not to say that out loud. The lunar selection had been announced 3 weeks prior. The council had been pressing Hubert for 2 years to choose a mate, and the winter summit, at which every neighbouring pack sent representatives, had forced the matter into urgency. If he arrived without a lunar, it would read as weakness. If he chose poorly, it would read as instability. If he chose well, and by that the council meant obediently, it would communicate to the Northern Territories that Ashmore Crown remained exactly as it had always been, structured, bloodline loyal, and safe for those at the top of it. 10 women had been selected from the most powerful houses. The invitations were a formality. Everyone understood that declining would be an insult. For weeks, the palace had been full of their perfume and careful laughter, their mothers strategizing in the guest corridors, their fathers pulling council members aside for quiet negotiations. Marilyn had spent those 3 weeks delivering meals to the guest wings, refilling water bowls in the infirmary, and ignoring the way the visiting she-wolves looked through her as though she were a useful piece of furniture. That's fine, she had told herself. I am good at being furniture. And then Hubert Carter had pointed at her in front of the whole pack. Guards arrived at her side within moments of the tray hitting the floor. They were not rough with her, which she found almost more disorienting than the pointing had been. They guided her out of the hall through the side passage, through 2 guarded corridors, and into a private receiving chamber on the second floor that she had only ever entered to bring firewood. She stood in the middle of that room and looked at the fire already burning in the grate, and the chair someone had clearly placed there for her, and she tried very hard to organize her thoughts into something coherent. It is a game, she decided, or a test, or a punishment for something she did not know she had done. Alpha Kings did not point at Omega servants during formal ceremonies, or that was not a thing that happened. The door opened. Hubert Carter walked in alone. He was even more substantial up close, not in the way that power sometimes manufactured itself, filling a room with noise and performance. He was substantial, the way old stone walls were. Simply there, settled into their purpose, making the space around them feel smaller without any particular effort. He sat in the chair across from hers, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the same level steadiness she had seen from across the hall. "You dropped the tray," he said. "You pointed at me," she answered, before she could stop herself. Something crossed his face. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "Fair," he said. "Marilyn Wortman? Yes. I chose you tonight in front of the pack and the council, but that choice is not a punishment, it is not a game, and it is not going to be taken back." She searched his face for the trick of it, for the secondary meaning, the political angle, the thing she was too simple or too low-ranking to understand. She found nothing but a man who looked like he had not slept properly in a long time and had made a decision he intended to keep. He means it. That was the most frightening thing she had encountered in her 23 years. He actually means it. "Why?" she said quietly. "Because I have been watching Ashmore Crown for 10 years, he said, "and you have been holding it together for nearly as long. You just did not know anyone was watching." She said nothing to that. She did not know what the correct response was. "You will be moved to the lunar quarters beginning tonight," he continued. "You will have a guard assigned. Lessons will begin in the morning. You will be treated with the respect owed to a chosen lunar, and anyone who fails to do that will answer to me directly." "The council will not allow this," she said. "I did not ask the council," he replied. "They will adjust." He stood. He crossed to the door, and then he stopped with one hand on the frame and glanced back at her. His voice dropped half a register, losing some of its command structure formality. "You have spent a long time making yourself easy to overlook. I understand why. But I am going to need you to stop doing that." He left before she could answer. Marilyn sat alone in the quiet room, with the fire and the chair and the sound of her own heartbeat, and tried to decide if she was terrified or awake for the first time in years. Both, she concluded, are definitely both. Down in the great hall, Kathy Bales hadn't moved from the ceremonial line. Her gown was still perfect. Her posture was still exact, but her jaw had tightened to the point where the fine muscles at the edge of it were visible, and her eyes, dark and precise as a blade, had not moved from the door through which Marilyn Wortman had been escorted. Her mother appeared at her elbow and murmured something low and careful. Kathy did not look at her. "Not now," she said softly. "Leave me." Her mother left. Kathy stood in the emptying hall and thought, with perfect calm, about what would need to happen next. 3 days before the selection, Marilyn had woken at 4:30 in the morning, because one of the pups in the nursery wing had been crying without stopping for 20 minutes, and the night attendant, a young wolf named Petra, who had only been on shift duty for 2 weeks, had run out of ideas. This was not unusual. Marilyn was often the one who arrived when ideas ran out. She had climbed 3 flights of stairs, still pulling her braid over her shoulder, and found the pup in question, a small boy of 4 named Corvin, sitting in the middle of his cot with his knees drawn up, his face red, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a very young shifter who had felt something move under his skin for the first time and could not make sense of it. The first pre-shift tremors. She had seen them before. She had crossed the room without hurrying, sat on the edge of his cot, and placed both her hands firmly on his small back. "It is not going to hurt you," she said. It is just part of what you are, and it knows you are too young, so it is not going to come all the way through. It is just saying hello. Corvin had looked at her with wet eyes. "Will it eat me?" he asked. "Absolutely not," she told him. "It lives inside you. It does not even have room to turn around in there properly. It is very cramped. It is much more uncomfortable for it than it is for you." The boy had blinked, and then, to Petra's visible relief, had actually laughed. A small, surprised laugh, but still. By the time Marilyn left, he was asleep. Petra had looked at her as though she had performed minor magic. Not magic, Marilyn had thought, walking back to her room. Just attention. The morning of the selection day, she had spent 3 hours in the lower kitchens mediating a supply dispute that had nearly turned physical between the head cook and the senior provisioner over the festival wine allocations. She had done it by agreeing loudly with both of them in separate conversations until each man believed she was entirely on his side, and then engineering a meeting in which she had suggested a solution so obvious that both men had claimed it as their own idea simultaneously. She had long since accepted that credit was a currency she did not get to spend. She had also stopped a young wolf named Taran from shifting in a corridor that afternoon. Taran was 17 and prone to anxiety spirals that came on fast, or she had spotted the particular tension in his jaw and the way he was breathing from the top of his lungs, and she had redirected him to the outer stable passage, talked him down over 20 minutes, and left him calmer than she had found him. Then she had collected the tray of goblets and gone to the great hall. She had not expected the night to go the way it went. Hubert had known all of it. He had known about Corvin. He had known about the supply dispute and the exact method she had used to resolve it. He had known about Taran and the stable corridor, and he had known about the 3 similar interventions in the month prior. He had known because, for 2 years, he had been quietly watching what actually held Ashmore Crown together when no one was performing strength for the council. He told her this on the second morning, after her first formal lesson in pack law, when she arrived back in the Lunar Suite, so tired and so overwhelmed by terminology that she sat directly on the floor instead of in the chair. He was standing by the window when she came in, reading a document. He looked up, noted where she had sat, and did not comment on it. "The Corvin pup's family sent a report," he said. "Standard nursery record. But I read all of them. You show up in those records more than anyone on the nursery staff does." "Someone had to," she said to the floor. "Yes, someone had to, and no one assigned to the role was doing it, so you did." He set down the document. "That is the pattern. Every time a system in this palace fails quietly, you appear. You fix it. You leave. No one notes your name." "That is how it works for people like me," she said. "Not anymore," he said. And then, before she could respond, he added, "Get off the floor. Your back will ache by evening." It was not kind, exactly. It was just accurate. Somehow that was easier to accept. She got off the floor. He handed her a cup of tea that had been sitting on the window ledge, still warm. He prepared that before I arrived, she realized. He knew I would be tired. She did not know what to do with a man who paid that kind of attention. It felt more dangerous in some ways than being overlooked. Kathy Bales came from the kind of family that had been preparing her for a specific kind of life, since she was old enough to sit upright without assistance. Her posture was architectural, her manners were surgical. She had been educated in pack law, household management, bloodline genealogy, and the particular art of moving through powerful spaces as though she owned them, because she was meant to. She was also genuinely intelligent, which made her more dangerous than people who underestimated beautiful women tended to assume. She found Marilyn in the courtyard garden on the 3rd day, during the brief window between morning lessons and the afternoon council briefing that Hubert had added to Marilyn's schedule over the protests of Elder Marsh. Kathy sat across from her at the garden table as though they had made an appointment. Her dark red gown caught the pale winter light and did something calculated with it. The fur trim at her shoulders framed her face precisely. Her expression was warm, composed, and entirely artificial. "You must be overwhelmed," she said gently. Marilyn looked at her, registered the warmth, and did not trust it. "I am managing," she said. "Of course you are." Kathy folded her hands on the table. "You are very capable. Everyone in the lower household knows that. You keep things running." There was something perfectly placed in the pause that followed that sentence, just enough space to let the phrase lower household settle. "Kathy," Marilyn said, keeping her voice even, "what do you actually want to say?" The warmth in Kathy's expression sharpened slightly, then relaxed again. She seemed faintly impressed despite herself. "I want to say," she said carefully, "that Ashmore Crown has a way of correcting itself. Positions are filled by those suited for them. The pack has a long memory. Whatever is happening now, it will settle into what it should be. And the women who understand that survive it. The ones who do not," she tilted her head slightly, "tend to find the pack a very unforgiving place." She stood. She smoothed her gown. "I do hope you get some rest," she added. "You look tired." She left. Marilyn sat alone in the courtyard and thought about what exactly about the conversation had felt like a warning and what had felt like a promise. She concluded that in Kathy's particular dialect, they were the same word. She is not going to come at me openly, Marilyn thought. She is going to come at the space around me. She is going to make the space smaller until I disappear back into it on my own. The worst part was, she knew exactly how to do that. She had spent her whole life watching powerful wolves use exactly that method on people who had no defense against it. The whispers started within the week. Rosanna Veth, and a high-born matriarch whose 3 daughters had all been on the selection list, moved through the palace like a woman who had decided that the truth was an inconvenience she did not owe anyone. The version of events she distributed through the noble corridors was consistent and precise. The Alpha King had made a rash choice under political pressure. The Omega Girl had maneuvered herself into view. It would all be corrected shortly. The servants heard a different version, one that was crueler and simpler. The king had lost his sense. The Omega had bewitched him somehow, and she would be gone before the winter summit. Marilyn heard both versions from Petra, who relayed them with the desperate energy of someone who had decided she was loyal to Marilyn, whether Marilyn wanted her to be or not. "You are not going to disappear, are you?" Petra said one morning, her voice low and anxious. "Because half the lower staff has started taking bets." "On which side?" Marilyn asked. "Even split." Petra hesitated. "Which I think means that half the palace believes you might actually stay." That was, Marilyn reflected, the most cautious version of hope she had ever heard. She decided to call it a start. Hubert had begun placing her in formal settings without announcement. A seat at the secondary council table, attendance at the morning reports, a position beside him at the evening meal, which had caused the noble gallery to vibrate with suppressed scandal for the entire duration of the soup course. It also meant he noticed her across rooms in ways that had stopped feeling accidental. The way he turned toward her when something was said that was meant to make her uncomfortable, not to intervene, just to note that he had seen it and registered it. The night of the 3rd week, he walked the long corridor back from the council chamber alongside her. Their footsteps matched on the stone, and he said without preamble, "Rosanna Veth told 3 council members this morning that you approached me in the hall, that you positioned yourself there on purpose." "And," Marilyn said, "but I told them I had placed you there because I knew I would find you on the edges, doing something useful, while everyone else performed being important." She glanced at him sideways. He was watching the corridor ahead. "Was that true?" she asked. "Close enough," he said. She thought about that for the rest of the evening. Close enough. It was the most honest kind of answer, and somehow the most disarming. Trisha Drain summoned her on a Thursday morning, not through a guard or a formal note, through Petra, who appeared in Marilyn's room at 7 with wide eyes and a message delivered verbatim, The Queen Mother requests the presence of the lunar candidate in the East morning room at 9. She said to tell you that breakfast will be served and that you should not worry, which is exactly the kind of thing that makes a person worry. Marilyn spent the intervening 2 hours trying to decide how much of herself to perform and how much to simply bring. She chose to bring herself, mostly because performing anything well required energy she was not sure she had that morning. Trisha Drain was the kind of woman who had been beautiful for so long that beauty had simply become irrelevant to her. What remained was something sharper and more durable. She sat by the east window in a grey-blue morning dress, her silver hair arranged without vanity, a cup of tea in one hand, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades deciding exactly how much power to allow a room to see in her at any given moment. She gestured at the chair across from her without standing. Marilyn sat. She did not curtsy, or because she had already cleared the threshold and it seemed too late, and also because she forgot. Trisha noticed. Something around her eyes adjusted. Not quite a smile. "The curtsy?" she said. "I know," Marilyn said. "I apologize. I was thinking about whether to do it while I was still in the corridor, and then I was already past the door." "What were you thinking about when you were in the corridor?" "Whether you were going to be kind or precise," Marilyn said honestly. "And which one would be more difficult to manage?" Trisha regarded her. "Both," she said. "Sit properly. Pour yourself tea. And tell me why you have not run." "Run?" Marilyn poured the tea, watching the cup rather than the Queen Mother. "From what my son has done. As most people in your position would have found a reason by now to decline quietly and return to what they knew." "I thought about it," Marilyn admitted. "On the first night. I thought, this is a trap of some kind, and the least painful exit is probably right now." "What stopped you?" Marilyn considered the question seriously. "He looked like he meant it," she said. "And in my experience, people who mean something rarely do. So it was, I suppose, interesting." Trisha asked her other things after that. About her childhood, about her father, whose name Marilyn knew, but whose face she barely recalled. About what she thought power was for, and what she thought it tended to do to people who had too much of it, and what she would do if she found herself holding more of it than she expected. Or Marilyn answered honestly, because she was too tired to do otherwise, and because something in the Queen Mother's face suggested that dishonesty would be detected and filed away without comment, which was a more unsettling consequence than being scolded. At the end, Trisha set down her cup. "I have one question about protocol," Marilyn said, because she had been wondering for 20 minutes. "During the formal presentation at the summit, there are apparently 12 different dining instruments. No one has told me which one belongs to which course, and I am fairly certain the distinction matters." "It matters less than you think," Trisha said. "What matters is whether you look like you already know." "And how do I look like I already know something I don't?" "Watch the person across the table. Or pick up your instrument 1/2 second after they do." Marilyn filed that away. It was, she reflected, probably the most useful thing anyone had told her since all of this started. That evening, she found Hubert in the outer library, reading. He did not look up when she came in, but he moved the stack of documents from the opposite chair. She sat. "Your mother tested me this morning," she said. "I know, she tests everyone. She did not seem opposed to you choosing me." "She's not." He turned a page. "She's cautious. There's a difference. She's been cautious about every decision I've made since I took the throne. Has she been right to be?" He looked up at that. "Sometimes," he said. "Not always." He paused. "Roger, ruling this pack feels like holding a structure together that was built by people who never agreed on what the structure was for. You push on one wall and 3 others shift. That is exactly what the lower kitchens feel like during a festival supply shortage," Marilyn said. He looked at her, and this time the thing around his eyes was unmistakably a smile. "Yes," he said. "I imagine it does." Alejandro Hatchett arrived at Ashmore Crown on the 15th day with 2 things: a sealed letter from the Council's investigative committee and a kind of measured elegance that suggested he had decided exactly how much of himself to reveal before entering the room. He was not large the way Hubert was large. He was precise, dark formal coat, clean lines, no ornamentation that served no purpose. He moved through spaces the way certain predators did, reading them before committing to a direction. Marilyn noticed him at the evening meal, and noticed, more significantly, that he was looking at her with the kind of interest that had nothing to do with attraction. It was the interest of someone who wanted something she had, and had not yet decided how to get it. She made note of him and said nothing. His official purpose was a routine background verification for the lunar candidate, a process the council had requested and that Hubert had permitted, because refusing would have looked like something to hide. Alejandro interviewed servants. He visited the records room. He walked through the lower household with the air of someone conducting a survey, asking mild or neutral questions that Marilyn recognized immediately as the kind that were not mild or neutral. He asked about her father, specifically about Darian Wortman, pack member, former warden assignment, deceased, and about what records existed regarding his posting and the circumstances of his death. The servants who spoke to him thought they were helping. They mentioned what little they knew, that Darian had died in the field, that the records were sealed, that no formal cause had ever been announced, that Marilyn had been very young and had never been told much. When Alejandro asked Marilyn directly, during a brief formal interview in the secondary parlor with a council scribe present, she answered every question with the simple honesty of someone who genuinely didn't know enough to be evasive. "I was 7 when he died," she said. "I remember his voice. I do not remember his face well. No one told me how it happened. No one offered to explain." "And you never sought to find out?" His tone was carefully neutral. "I was an Omega child with no family and no standing. Who exactly was I supposed to ask?" Something flickered in his expression. He wrote something down. "Thank you," he said. "That will be all for now." For now, she thought. Those 2 words were doing a great deal of work. She told Hubert that evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Yes, and then he said, "Alejandro Hatchett has been pursuing a council appointment for 3 years. The seat he wants belongs to the Border Trade Committee. The committee's authority depends on who controls the winter access corridors. Those corridors run through land that has been in jurisdictional dispute for 20 years. "And my father was connected to that land?" Marilyn said. "I do not know the full shape of it yet," Hubert said, "but the fact that Alejandro is asking about him specifically tells me someone does. What does that mean for me?" He looked at her directly. "It means that what happened to your father may have been less accidental than the pack was told. And it means that someone who benefits from the current arrangement is worried that you might find that out." She sat with that for a long moment. "Oh, should I be frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without softening it. "And I need you to tell me the moment anything unexpected happens. Not after. The moment. You're very direct for someone trying to be reassuring," she said. "I am not trying to reassure you," he said. "I am trying to make sure nothing happens to you. Those are different aims." She thought. He trusts me with the truth, even when it is not comfortable. She was not entirely sure what to do with that yet. But she did not hate it. 3 days later, someone broke into the lower archive room during the deep hours of the night. A night guard found the door open and a filing cabinet forced. Among the documents disturbed, a sealed folder in the name of Darian Wortman, Warden Record, Border Territory Filing, Year 9 of the Ashmore Compact. The folder was still there, but something inside it was not. A fragment of her father's personal seal, a piece of pressed wax attached to a formal declaration, was gone. The guard reported it to Hubert at dawn. Marilyn was in the archive corridor when Hubert arrived, having come down to check on a secondary record request she had submitted for her own curiosity, and found the guard and the open door instead. She was standing very still in the corridor with her back against the stone wall, and she was not shaking, which she was quite proud of, though she had been shaking a few minutes ago. Hubert came through the outer door, took in the scene, and then looked at her with the particular expression of someone who was containing their reaction with a great deal of discipline. He crossed the corridor to where she stood. He stopped close enough that she could see the fine tension at the edge of his jaw. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No. I arrived after. I only found the door." She paused. "Someone took something from my father's record. A piece of his seal. I know. Alejandro Hatchet was in this building yesterday afternoon," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know that too," he said, and then, with a quietness that had nothing controlled about it, "Go back to the suite. Do not go anywhere without the guard until I have spoken to you again." She went. But she noted the way he had said it, stripped of the formal precision he wore in council chambers, and she thought he was afraid. Not for the pack or for his throne. For me, she realized. He was afraid for me. She did not know how to carry that. She carried it anyway. The fire started at the seam between the Omega quarters and the outer records passage, in a storage alcove where old linen and dried herbs were kept. It started small. By the time the smell reached the sleeping corridor, it was not small. Marilyn was awake because she was almost always awake at that hour. She heard the first shout before any alarm, and she was out of bed and moving before she had finished processing what the sound meant. The smoke was low and fast. The lower wing of the palace was old construction, the corridors narrow, the exits fewer than they should have been. 4 families of palace staff lived in that section. 2 elderly wolves who could not move quickly. 3 children who should not have been there at all, but were, because the designated family wing had been reassigned to visiting noble guests for the selection period. Marilyn knew where everyone was. She had always known, because knowing was how she kept things from falling apart. She got the children out first, 2 trips through the thickening corridor, moving fast, carrying the smallest, pressing the other 2 ahead of her with the controlled voice of someone who was not going to let anyone slow down for the luxury of panicking. She handed them to a guard at the outer passage gate. Then she went back for Elena, the elder wolf from the east room, who could not manage the stairs without assistance. The guards arrived at the entrance when she was on the second return. They told her to stop. "Elena is still inside," she said. "We'll get her. You need to clear the—" She was already back through the door. She got Elena out through the side passage. The old wolf was coughing. Marilyn was coughing. The smoke by that point had texture, and the narrow passage had made the heat remarkable. But they came out the side door into the cold night air, and Marilyn kept Elena upright until 2 guards reached them and took the old wolf's weight. She stood in the courtyard in the winter cold, one hand braced on the outer wall, coughing, ash in her hair, her night shift damp from the heat. A frightened pup she had apparently been carrying the whole time still pressed against her side. She looked down at the child and could not quite remember when she had picked him up again. "Corvin," she noted. "Of course." He looked up at her with enormous eyes. "Oh, you said it does not eat you," he said seriously. "This was different," she managed. "Did it almost eat you?" "No," she said, though her voice was rougher than she wanted. It did not even get close. Hubert arrived in the courtyard 12 minutes after the alarm. He came from the main wing at speed, and the first thing he did was scan the assembled survivors until he found her. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped in front of her, looked at her face, the ash and the cough, and the child she was still holding, and something in him went very quiet. "You went back in twice," he said. It was not a question. "Elena cannot manage the stairs," she said. He took Corvin from her arms with a gentleness that briefly stopped her breathing. He handed the child to a guard. Then he reached out and placed one hand at the back of her neck, not holding her, just present, and checked her face for harm the way a person does when they are keeping themselves from doing something they cannot do in a courtyard full of people, she thought. He is keeping himself together right now, for the courtyard. And she understood that and was grateful for it, and also felt the warmth of his hand like something she was not going to be able to unfeel. "Come inside," he said. The healers need to check you. The children are all accounted for. Come inside, Marilyn. She let him guide her. She was not sure she had ever let anyone guide her anywhere before without feeling like it was a concession. This did not feel like that. The morning report brought Kathy's response. She had been, apparently, among the guests who had gathered at the upper windows to watch the evacuation. By midday, a version of events had been circulating through the noble quarters. The Omega girl had caused a commotion, the staff had panicked around her, and the drama had been exaggerated. A secondary version, more carefully distributed. There was a question of how the fire had started, and whether it was related to the archive disturbance, and whether the palace was becoming unstable under its current management. Not under its current management, Marilyn thought when Petra relayed it, against it. But she noted something else in the courtyard report, the way two older wolves had stopped her on her way back through the outer hall, both of them servants, both of them unknown to her. One had pressed a cloth into her hand without speaking. The other had simply nodded, a slow, deliberate nod, the kind that meant something. The pack watched with contempt and with fear, but it also watched with other things. Hope, she thought, in people who had been told not to have any. She recognized it because she had felt it herself. Exactly once, when a man in the great hall had pointed at her and refused to look away. Hubert took her out of the palace on the 7th day after the fire. Not a formal ride, not an escort, just 2 horses, 2 guards a respectful distance behind, and the winter ridge that ran along the eastern edge of Ashmore Crown's territory, where the granite broke the tree line, and you could see the corridor lands stretching north in long, pale strips between the forest and the hills. It was cold and sharp and entirely quiet. Marilyn had not been outside the palace walls in 3 weeks. She had not realized what that had cost her until the open air hit her face and something in her lungs relaxed for the first time since a man had pointed at her in the great hall. They rode for a while without speaking. That was its own kind of information. But he was not filling the silence with performance. He was simply in it, the same way he occupied every room, as though he belonged wherever he was and did not need to justify it. Eventually he said, "You have been quieter since the fire." "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether I am actually doing anything here, or just being kept somewhere safer while other people fight over what I mean to them." He was quiet for a moment. "You handled the Corvin situation the night before the selection," he said, "and the kitchen dispute, and Taran in the corridor. None of those were assigned to you. You simply did them because they needed doing." "Those were the things I have always done," she said. "They do not feel like strategy." "No," he said. "They feel like a character. That is harder to manufacture than strategy, and worth significantly more." She looked out over the winter ridge. The corridor lands stretched north, grey-silver and still. "Why did you really choose me?" she asked, not the answer about watching the household. "The one under that." He did not answer immediately. She had begun to recognize this about him. He did not fill silences with words he had not yet meant. He waited until he knew what he wanted to say. "Because you calm things without asking anyone to thank you for it," he said. "And because Ashmore Crown has been run by people who mistake noise for strength for a long time, the pack needs something steadier than that. And because," he paused, "because I have spent 10 years ruling this place, and I have never once felt the hall settle the way it did when you were in it." "I was carrying goblets," she said. "I know. It did not matter what you were carrying." She did not know how to answer that. She looked at him from the side, at the hard line of his jaw against the pale winter sky, and felt something warm and frightening opening in the center of her chest that she was not yet ready to name. "I do not know how to be wanted," she said finally, "without waiting for the part where it turns out there is a condition." "I know," he said. "You flinch when people are kind to you. You apologize before you have done anything wrong. You leave the edge of the chair by exactly the distance that lets you stand quickly if you need to." She blinked. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything about you," he said simply, without making it a declaration. I have been noticing you for a long time." The thing in her chest became considerably more difficult to breathe around. They stopped on the ridge. The horses settled. Below them, the corridor lands ran to the northern tree line, and beyond that, somewhere in the distance, was the territory her father had once been assigned to protect. Hubert was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold. She had not noticed them stopping quite close together. She suspected he had. "You are frightening," she said, "even when you are trying to be kind." Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. "That is," he said, "unfortunately my gentlest face." She laughed. It came out before she decided to let it, which was how she knew it was real. He turned toward her. The winter light was flat and clear, and it put his face in detail, the tiredness under his eyes, the stillness that was not absence of feeling, but the exact opposite. He raised one hand, and with careful, deliberate movement, pushed the loose strand of hair back from her face. His hand paused at her jaw, not holding, not demanding, simply present. She did not flinch. "I did not flinch," she thought, with a wonder that was almost funny. He was leaning toward her in the way that slow, inevitable things lean, when one of the distant guards cleared his throat with the elaborate loudness of someone doing them a favor they had not asked for. Hubert closed his eyes briefly. "Council message," the guard called. "Urgent." "Of course it is," Hubert said, under his breath, to no one. He stepped back. He took the message. He read it. And the quiet expression he had worn on the ridge was replaced by the one that governed council chambers. "We need to go back," he said. "What happened?" she asked. "Alejandro has requested a formal inquiry session before the full Elder Board. He is bringing the matter of your father's records to open council." The winter air between them shifted. And here it is, she thought. The condition. But then she looked at him, at the set of his jaw, and the way he had folded the letter with a particular deliberateness that meant he was deciding exactly what he was going to do about it. He does not look like a man who is about to let go of something. She followed him back down the ridge, the warmth where his hand had been still registered at her jaw. That, she thought, is going to be very difficult to unfeel. The Elder Board convened in the formal council chamber 3 days before the winter summit. The chamber was old and severe, its walls hung with territorial maps and the crests of every bloodline house that had ever held a seat. The air in it smelled of old wood and accumulated judgment. Marilyn sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap and her back straight. Alejandro stood at the center of the council floor. He was dressed with immaculate precision, as though the meeting had been planned for weeks, which Marilyn suspected it had been. He laid out the case with the calm of someone who had rehearsed it until every hesitation was deliberate. Darian Wortman had been a warden assigned to the northern border corridor during a period of disputed territorial jurisdiction. During his assignment, he had prepared sealed documentation regarding the legal status of the winter access routes, documentation that had been classified at his death and never formally reviewed. Darian's daughter, currently in the position of Luna candidate, was his sole surviving heir. If that documentation contained a territorial claim tied to his warden record, it would give the Luna candidate a legal link to the disputed corridor. This would make her not merely an unsuitable mate for the Alpha King. Alejandro's tone was almost gentle about this, but a political complication with implications for every border house represented at the winter summit. The board murmured. "The simplest resolution," Alejandro concluded, "is to review the documentation, assess the claim, and remove the candidate from the palace while the matter is evaluated. This protects the summit proceedings from conflict." Elder Marsh, who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, nodded with the urgency of a man who had been wound tight for weeks. Marilyn kept her hands still. "So that is the shape of it," she thought. "I am not a scandal. I am a legal instrument that the wrong person is holding." Hubert sat at the head of the council table. He had not spoken yet. "The candidate may respond," said Elder Varron, the oldest and most senior of the board members, his voice like gravel settling. Marilyn looked at Alejandro. "My father was a warden," she said. "He died when I was 7. I did not know his records existed until a man who was recently seen near the archive room after a break-in told me he had questions about them. I have no knowledge of any territorial claim. I have no legal counsel. And I notice that the resolution being proposed benefits exactly the houses that presented candidates at the Luna selection." Silence. "That is not an answer to the question of the claim," Alejandro said. "No," she said. "It is an observation about who is asking." The session recess broke for lunch. In the corridor outside, Rosanna Veth materialized beside Marilyn with the energy of a woman who had been waiting for the right hallway. "You should consider leaving voluntarily," Rosanna said quietly, pleasantly. "A graceful departure is still a departure with dignity. What comes next will not be." Marilyn stopped walking. She looked at Rosanna, at the calculated pleasantness, the fine coat, the jewelry that announced status in every line. "My father died protecting something from people who wanted to profit from the Pack's winter survival corridor," Marilyn said. "He did not leave voluntarily. I do not plan to either." She walked away before Rosanna could answer. She had no idea if that was true. She barely knew what she was asserting, but it had felt, for the first time in her life, exactly right. Trisha Drain was waiting for Hubert when he returned to the private chamber after the morning session. She set a folded document on the table between them. "I have had this for 6 years," she said. "I took it from the secondary records before the archive reorganization because I didn't trust the council clerk who was overseeing it. I was right not to." Hubert looked at the document, then at his mother. "Why did you wait?" he said. "Because I needed to know whether you would choose rightly when it mattered," she said, "and whether the girl would be worth protecting when the pressure arrived." A pause. "She is." He opened the document. It was a single page, in his father's record-keeping hand, signed and sealed with the Pack's Warden Authority seal. A note confirming that Darian Wortman had submitted sealed testimony to the Border Trade Committee, designating the Winter Access Corridor as shared Pack territory, not bloodline-controlled land. The note confirmed the submission had been received. There was no record of it ever being acted upon. And there was a secondary seal in the corner, the mark of the Border Trade Committee from that period. The committee chair at that time had been Alejandro Hatchett's father. Hubert looked at the document for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his coat, and went to find Marilyn. The Winter Summit brought every neighboring clan into Ashmore Crown's Great Hall, the same hall where Marilyn had stood with a tray 4 weeks ago, the same stone floors, the same iron chandeliers. But this time, the space was pressed full of wolves from 6 different territories, their representatives seated in tiered rows, their eyes moving between the Alpha King and the Omega girl at his left, working out what exactly they were looking at. Alejandro had timed it deliberately. The territorial inquiry had been folded into the summit proceedings, presenting it as a matter of pack-wide interest that required collective resolution. The framing was elegant. This was not a personal attack on any individual. This was due process. Marilyn sat in the secondary seat assigned to her and watched the room gather itself. Kathy had positioned herself in the gallery with the visiting representatives from 2 neighboring clans, both of whose bloodlines had long-standing economic ties to the border corridor. She was not visible as a player in the proceeding. She was visible as a solution, composed, high-born, available. Rosanna and her daughters occupied a corner of the hall floor with the strategic cohesion of a military unit. Elder Marsh opened the formal session. The case was presented again, but this time before the full summit. Alejandro walked the assembled representatives through the history of the corridor dispute, the sealed documentation, the legal implications, and the threat that unresolved territorial ambiguities posed to the peace of the summit proceedings. His conclusion, presented with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had already won, was that removing the candidate from the Luna position pending investigation would allow the summit to proceed without conflict. He proposed the council accept a motion to do so. Several visiting representatives nodded. Hubert had not spoken yet. He sat at the head of the central table with the stillness that frightened people more than shouting did. Then Marilyn stood. It was not planned. No one had told her to do it. It came from the same place that had made her walk back into the burning corridor, the certainty that if she didn't move, something important would be lost before it could be saved. "I want to say something," she said. The room turned. "I know what is being proposed here," she continued, "and I understand why it seems reasonable. But I have been in this pack my whole life, making myself easier to remove, staying small, leaving rooms before I was asked. I know how to do this. I have done it 100 times. She paused. "But my father did not leave. He documented the truth about this corridor, and he sealed it against people who wanted to profit from it. And he died before anyone in authority asked him a single question about what he had found. And if I walk out of this hall today, the same people who buried what he did will have done it again. And they will use me to do it, because I have spent my whole life making myself convenient for exactly that." The hall was quiet. "So I am telling you now that I will not leave. Not because I believe I am powerful enough to stop what is coming, but because the only way my father's death means anything is if what he protected is finally seen by people who are not paid to look away from it." She sat back down. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat on the table. "I should not have done that," said the part of her that had spent 23 years surviving. Too visible. Too loud. "Yes," said something deeper and newer. And it was exactly right. Alejandro recovered quickly. "An emotional appeal does not resolve a legal matter," he said smoothly, to the room rather than to her. "The motion stands." And then Hubert Carter stood up. The room recalibrated instantly. When that particular man moved from seated to standing, my every other presence in the hall became secondary. "Before the motion is called," he said, "I have a document for the summit record." He placed the folded page on the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This is a record note from the archive of my father's council. It confirms that Darian Wortman submitted sealed testimony to the Border Trade Committee, designating the Winter Corridor as shared packland. It confirms that testimony was received. It confirms that it was never acted upon. The committee chair who received and suppressed that testimony was Marcos Hatchett." A beat. Alejandro Hatchett's father. The hall shifted. Not with noise, with the particular physical reorganization of a room in which the power has moved. "The motion before this summit is not about protecting the proceedings from conflict," Hubert continued. "It is about repeating the same burial that was performed 30 years ago. Alejandro Hatchett and Kathy Bales, who has been coordinating with him since the 3rd day of the selection process, have been working to force this pack into a politically advantageous marriage that would give their bloodlines control of a corridor that my father's council sealed in trust for every wolf in Ashmore Crown." He looked at Alejandro. "You want to talk about due process? Let us talk about whose process this has ever been due." Elder Varron called for a recess. Alejandro was very still. Kathy in the gallery looked at Rosanna. Rosanna, for the first time in Marilyn's experience, did not seem to know what to do with her face. Tricia Drain, seated at the far end of the council table, unfolded her hands in her lap. She looked at Marilyn across the full length of the hall. She gave a single, slow nod. The summit reconvened in the afternoon with the weight of a room that had spent 3 hours rearranging its understanding of what it had been watching. Elder Varron called the session. The recess investigation had been swift and definitive because Hubert had been preparing it for days. Alejandro's coordination with Kathy was documented. A series of messages passed through Rosanna's household, a meeting in the border representatives' quarter the night of the fire, the nature of his access to the archive room on the day before the break-in. The old documents were verified by 2 independent archivists brought from the neutral pack of Grevon specifically for this summit. The evidence of what Marcos Hatchett had buried and what his son had tried to keep buried was entered into the public summit record. When the formal findings were read, Alejandro submitted no defense. He sat in his chair with the particular rigidity of a man who had calculated every outcome except this one. His rank and title before the Border Trade Committee was suspended pending a full investigation. The council seat he had been pursuing was formally closed to his candidacy. Cathy was stripped of her formal standing as a presented candidate and asked to leave the summit proceedings. She did so. She did it with immaculate posture and her chin up, and Marilyn found, to her own surprise, that she did not feel satisfaction about it. She felt something closer to tired sadness for a woman who had been trained to want exactly the thing she was losing, and had never been told there were other ways to build a life. Rosanna's family lost the political alliance that the selection had been meant to secure them. They would retain their standing in the pack, but the influence they had leveraged, the relationships built on proximity to the throne's future, dissolved with the public record. Then Elder Varen looked at Hubert. "The matter of the lunar selection remains open," he said. "The summit requires resolution." Hubert stood. He turned to Marilyn. She met his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not lower her head. This is the moment, she knew. This is the second one. And it is different from the first because I am different. The first time I stood there, I was waiting for the trick. This time I am waiting for nothing. I am simply here. Marilyn Wortman, Hubert said, in the formal declaration voice that carried to every corner of the hall. I named you my chosen Luna 4 weeks ago in this hall. Everything that has happened since has confirmed what I believed when I made that choice. I am naming you again, publicly, before every representative gathered at this summit. Not as a compromise, not as a demonstration, as my equal and my chosen. He walked to her. He extended his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought of every room she had left before being asked to go, every word she had swallowed, every inch of herself she had trimmed and flattened and made convenient for the comfort of people who gave her nothing in return. She took his hand. She stood. The hall was quiet. Then, from somewhere in the middle ranks of the assembly, a wolf clapped once, then again. Then a second wolf joined, then 5. Then the sound became continuous and broad, and not polite at all, but genuine, the kind of sound a room makes when it has been waiting to say something, and finally has permission. Trisha Drain walked to the front of the hall. She was carrying a small object, a simple silver band, the formal lunar emblem of Ashmore Crown, plain and old, and almost severe in its lack of ornamentation. She stopped in front of Marilyn. Marilyn, for once, did not step back. Trisha placed the band at Marilyn's wrist. Her hands were steady and precise. Her face was composed. And then she said, quietly enough that only Marilyn and Hubert could hear, "This pack has mistaken noise for strength for too long. Welcome." Marilyn did not cry.
Welcome.
She had not planned not to. It simply did not happen. She was too full of something that was not grief or relief, but more like the sensation of a door opening in a wall she had stopped expecting to move. I am here, she thought. I am standing here, and no one is about to ask me to be smaller. That evening, after the summit representatives had settled into the formal dinner, after the public proceedings had moved into the slower work of treaty updates and border resolutions, Hubert took her back to the outer library. They sat in the 2 chairs by the window. The winter dark had settled over the ridge, and the corridor lands beyond. He had a cup of something warm. So did she. She had stopped being surprised that he thought of it ahead of time, and for a while they were just quiet, the good kind. Your father's testimony is going into the formal pack record, he said eventually. The corridor designation will be restored to shared territory law. His name will be on the record note. She looked at the dark window. He kept a record so the truth would exist, she said, even when no one was going to listen for a very long time. Yes. That is a strange kind of courage, she said, to write something down for someone you will never meet. He knew someone would eventually find it. She thought, I think he hoped it would matter to someone. I think he died hoping. She turned to look at Hubert. He was watching her with the same steadiness he had worn in the great hall on the night they began, except that the distance was gone from it. Up close, without the ceremony and the political weight, he looked like a man who was simply tired and had stopped performing the parts of himself that were not real. You should sleep, she said. Probably, he agreed. He did not move. You look like someone who has been holding stone walls together with his hands, she said. That is what you told me you felt like. Still accurate. You could, she said carefully. Put some of that down. Occasionally. He looked at her for a long moment. Only if someone competent is watching, he said. I have been watching this pack since I was old enough to carry goblets, she said. I believe I qualify. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not the formal clasp of public declaration. Something else. Something that did not have a ceremonial name and was better for it. Yes, he said. You do. Later. Much later. She stood at the window of the lunar suite and looked out at the great hall roof below, the chandeliers still burning amber behind the high windows. She thought of the girl who had stood in that hall with a tray, who had believed that being useful was the only right she had, who had gone through 23 years making herself a convenient absence. She pressed one hand to the cold glass. I did not disappear, she said to that girl. I did not make myself small enough, and I did not leave. And look at where we are. Below in the courtyard, a guard was making rounds. He looked up at the lighted window and briefly slowed his pace, the simple acknowledgement of a wolf who had clapped in the summit hall that afternoon. Marilyn lifted her chin. She did not lower it. Before this story ends completely, but let me say something from the heart. If Marilyn's journey moved you, if Hubert's second choice felt like something you needed to see, if you have ever known what it feels like to be useful to everyone and chosen by no one, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe if you have not yet. Like this video. Leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. Those small actions help stories like this one find the people who need them most. I would love to know you were here when this one found its place. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with recognition. And maybe that is the rarer mercy. Marilyn did not become worthy because a crown touched her head. She had always been worth the space she occupied. The problem was that she had spent a lifetime believing otherwise, and the people who benefited from that belief had worked very hard to keep her in it. Hubert did not become a great king because he held the loudest hall. He became one because when the moment came to protect the truth in public, at cost, in front of people who would rather the truth stayed buried, he did not step back from it. Not once. Not even when it was easier and quieter and more politically convenient to let her go. And the wolves who built their power on bloodline, cruelty, and arrangement learned what people like that always learn eventually. The room they controlled has a long memory. Sooner or later, it becomes the room that watches them fall. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. Stories that move us tend to carry something real beneath the surface. Here are the truths this one held, offered plainly. 1. But quiet service is not the same as low worth. Marilyn spent years doing the work that kept everyone else going. She was never thanked for it. That is a recognizable truth. In workplaces, in families, in communities, the people who hold everything together are often the last to be acknowledged and the first to be told they do not belong. Her story asks us to look at who we depend on and whether we have ever said so out loud. 2. Power without character is predatory. Kathy had polish, rank, and preparation. Alejandro had intelligence and access. Rosianna had connections and a long memory. None of those advantages made them good. They used every tool they had to preserve a system that served them and crushed anyone in the way. Rank, beauty, and influence are not character. What a person does with advantage, especially toward those who have less, is the true measure. 3. Real leadership is proven by what it protects publicly. Hubert knew the truth privately for weeks, but the truth only matters in a community when someone is willing to say it in the room where people can hear it and where it costs something. Knowing what is right while staying silent is not virtue. It is comfort wearing virtue's clothes. 4. Self-erasure is not humility. But Marilyn had learned to make herself small as a survival strategy. For years it worked. But survival strategies can become cages. There is a difference between choosing not to fight and having forgotten you had the right to. Marilyn's arc is not the story of someone becoming powerful. It is the story of someone remembering that they were already human, which was always enough. 5. Inheritance is not always treasure. What Marilyn received from her father was not comfort, elevation, or an easy answer. It was responsibility, truth, and moral weight. She inherited a problem that was bigger than her, created by people who were more powerful than her, in a world that had never given her the tools to manage it. That is realistic. That is how legacies actually work. What mattered was what she chose to do with it. 6. As a community is only as honest as what it is willing to remember. Ashmore Crown had buried Darian Vortman's testimony and let his daughter grow up without her father's name or his story. Every community has its buried documents, the things that were done and sealed away because the truth was inconvenient for the people who held the seal. Health comes from being willing to open them. 7. Being chosen is not the same as being safe. Both matter. Hubert's choice created danger, not comfort. That is true. But the presence of danger was not a sign that the choice was wrong. The measure of whether a relationship is real is not whether it is easy, but whether the people in it hold each other's humanity when things become costly. 8. The people who mock quiet strength pay for it slowly. Kathy, Alejandro, and Rosanna did not lose because of a single mistake. They lost because their entire framework for measuring worth was wrong, and frameworks that are wrong tend to lead people into rooms they cannot talk their way out of. The consequences came in proportion to the arrogance. That is not vengeance. That is simply cause and effect, running its patient course. There is more coming, more dangerous choices, more unforgettable women, more men who must prove whether the power they carry deserves the hearts they are asking for. So stay near. Until the next story, take care of your heart, guard your peace, and never mistake quiet strength for weakness. Thank you for watching.